Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maritza Peachin. I'm Deputy Director for Equitable Development with the City of Richmond. Brian, why don't you go ahead and share the presentation. Great. So welcome, everyone. My name is Maritza Peachin. I am Deputy Director for Equitable Development with the City of Richmond. The Office of Equitable Development works across city departments to implement the citywide master plan Richmond 300 and also works with external partners to do the same. One of the things that's been identified in the master plan and through several resolutions are these 3 zoning changes. And we're really delighted to have all of you here. We are recording this presentation, so it will be posted on our website. Last night we had a meeting at the main library with about 120 people in attendance. So clearly these are topics that people are very interested in. You can go to the next slide. I'm fortunate to have 2 individuals from the city joining me today. Brian Mercer is running these projects. He's the official project manager for all 3. And Allison Beatty, and he works for the planning department. And Allison Beatty is going to be kind of leading the charge on the short-term rental review part, and she works for the office of the Chief Administrative Officer of the city. So they're going to be doing most of the presentation. This is a project where we are involving a lot of other city departments. We've met with all of these departments that are listed here prior to this meeting, talking about these 3 zoning changes and how they may impact their departments. Because we know that zoning not only impacts how private landowners use their land, but also might have implications for housing, economic development, finance, public works, and the like. So this is definitely a collaborative effort where we're working with these other departments. We're not just doing this on our own in the planning department. Next slide. The 3 things we're going to be talking about today, and if you all have your little confined on your screen where it has reactions, and if you can raise your hand, get your finger on that. So raise your hand if you are here because you are interested in the short-term rental regulations on the revisions to that one. All right, so we got a few people who are playing along with my game. Awesome, about 10. Now keep them raised or take them down if you're here because of parking space minimums and that change to the zoning ordinance. So that's with the eliminating of parking minimums. All right, numbers are going up a little bit. Keep them raised if you're also interested in accessory dwelling units, or raise your hand if you're interested in those. Lots more came up on that. Interesting. Cool. Well, thanks a lot. You can all take your hands down. This kind of shows, so last night when we did this little poll, we had a lot of people raise their hands multiple times. And it just showed that we decided to put all 3 of these together in one set of community engagement because we figured that most people would be interested in multiple of them. So we decided to do that instead of having 3 separate community engagement processes. So we will be talking about these all together. However, ultimately, they will each be individual ordinances or laws brought to City Council. So they aren't going to be coupled together as laws. They're going to be introduced individually. And so if you are joining us right now, if you can share your camera, but I would not share your camera because we're recording this. So then your face and whatever you're doing in the background is part of our video. So you may want to turn off your camera if you haven't done so yet. Great. I'm going to turn it over to Allison, who's going to talk about the short-term rental regulations. Oh, one thing that I forgot to mention, I did this before with you, Allison. These are last night. Right now, we're like talking about what council or planning commission has asked us to study. and we're just starting the process to study these things. So today we do not have any official recommendations of what the zoning changes will be. Rather, we're talking about what maybe they could be, or what people's questions might be related to these topics. All right, go ahead, Allison.
Thank you, Maritza, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Allison Beatty. I work in the Chief Administrative Office here at the City of Richmond, collaborating with our Planning and Development Review team on these 3 zoning changes. So the first slide is just background on how the Virginia Code currently reads for short-term rentals in Richmond. The most important component of this, I would say, is that when you rent out a space via Airbnb, HomeAway, or Vrbo, this is for a period of fewer than 30 consecutive days in exchange for a charge for the occupancy. This slide shows a history of short-term rental regulations in Richmond. This journey began in 2015. In 2020, our City Council passed the ordinance for short-term rental regulations in the City of Richmond. And now we are here in 2022 speaking with the community on next steps for possible amendments to this ordinance. Our current short-term rental regulations are as follows. I'll read these to everyone. Permitted as an accessory use in any zoning district that permits residential uses. May be entire dwelling unit or individual rooms. Only property owners may be operators, and you do need condominium or co-op approval if you live in a multifamily dwelling. It must be your primary residence. So 185 days in the residence you should live as the property owner if you're operating an Airbnb. The property owner and operator is not required to be on the property during the rental, but again, it must be your primary residence. There are limitations to the number of nights a dwelling can be used. As we discussed, it's 30 consecutive days. You can have no more than 5 sleeping rooms if you live in a single family home and are Airbnb-ing those rooms. And a short-term rental permit must be obtained on a biennial basis, and that is a $300 charge. This is currently where most of the short-term rentals in the City of Richmond are concentrated as of January 2022. You'll notice Museum District, Fan, Monroe Ward, Jackson Ward, Shockoe, and Churchill all are indicated using these red dots. Thank you, Brian. So currently we have 114 short-term rental permits. However, we do know that there's over 800 active rentals on Airbnb. So we would like to hopefully work with the community to determine how we can get all of those 800 with permits. The resolution of intent, which our planning director, Kevin Vonk, presented to the Planning Commission in January of 2022, was to amend the short-term rental regulations. We want to keep promoting short-term rentals, but want to see how we can fix the regulations to potentially help with compliance. And the current regulations are difficult to enforce effectively, efficiently, and equitably, so we'd like to work with the community to determine next steps for making sure that we can regulate these accordingly. Currently, some of the feedback that we had received from the community and that Kevin presented in his presentation to the Planning Commission have generally positive remarks, neutral or inconclusive, and generally negative, as you see here. Having short-term rentals does align with our Richmond 300 in supporting diverse economies and including recommendations to growing, retaining, and attracting businesses in tourism and anchor institutions. So short-term rentals are critical to our tourism aspect of our Richmond 300. Some considerations for discussion, but again, this is just this is the kickoff for thinking about the different ways in which we can amend this legislation: primary residency requirements, primary versus accessory use, remittance of transient occupancy tax, similar to a hotel tax, so taxing Airbnbs as a hotel. Number of nights as a dwelling unit can be used as an STR, perhaps less than 30, perhaps more, and then kind of enforcement ideas for noncompliance. Again, we have 114 active permits, but over 800 people participating in these short-term rentals. So what are the best ways to enforce noncompliance? And now I will turn it over to Brian for eliminating parking minimums, and we will take questions about STRs at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Allison. My name is Brian Mercer. I'm a planner here in the Department of Planning and Development Review. I've been with the PDR for over 5 years, and for most of those 5 years, I was in zoning administration division, so I dealt firsthand with the frustrations from city residents, business owners, and even STR hosts about these three zoning topics. So I'm really using my experience and my knowledge of the zoning ordinance to guide us through this process. So the second zoning change we're looking at is eliminating parking space minimums. And before I dive into the parking space requirements, I want to give you a little brief history of how zoning or parking space requirements came about in the city of Richmond. So we know that Richmond has been around for a few hundred years now, but it wasn't until 1927 until the first city zoning ordinance was adopted. And even then, it was just a few residential districts, a few commercial districts, a few industrial districts. It had no reference to parking. And there were some changes over the next few years, but it's not until 1943 until you see reference to parking requirements. And a lot of those were for a duplex, you have to provide a parking space in a carriage house. And for some commercial uses, it required parking spaces based on floor area, but not in all zoning districts that required parking. So you even had parts of the city that didn't require parking. So we have, up until 1943, we have a lot of older buildings in the city, mostly you see along downtown, Carytown, West Brooklyn Park Boulevard, where you have a lot of these commercial uses that were established prior to any parking requirements. And then as cars became more prevalent in the city, it's not until 1960 where you see a separate section in the zoning ordinance dedicated to parking. And as you see here to the right, they break it down by the different use and the parking requirement for each use. So we've had some changes since 1960, which I'll get into more, but this is kind of just a brief history of how parking spaces became a thing in Richmond. So as I mentioned, the parking requirements in the city are similar. They're broken down by different uses, and then the parking space for each use that is required. And the map here to the right, you'll see, some of you may have seen this before. It's really a walkability map of the city of Richmond. And your darker blue areas are the more urban parts of the city that are more walkable. And then as you get out to the redder areas, those are where it's more car dependent. So since 1960, over time, we've created these parking overlay and parking exempt districts where we look at these darker blue or even lighter blue areas and say, hey, maybe we don't need as much off-street parking required as maybe in the red areas. So in these parking overlay and parking exempt districts, there are only parking required for certain uses and even at a lesser requirement. So if a restaurant is typically 1 per 100 square feet, in these overlay districts, it may be 1 per 300 square feet. And then over, even since then, we've created zoning districts where we said that no parking is required except for dwelling uses, hotels, and motels. So a large majority of downtown, and you'll see some going along Broad Street. We recently created a new TOD, transit-oriented nodal district, that does not require any parking except for the dwelling uses, hotels, and motels. And that was from the Pulse Corridor Plan in 2017. So this just shows that over time, we've identified areas that really don't require as much parking as you would see here in the red parts of the city. Just a little background of what are parking minimums. Typically for residential uses, they're based on the number of dwelling units. So some zoning districts, it'll be 1 per dwelling unit. Some zoning districts, it'll be 1 per 2 dwelling units, and even 1 per 4 dwelling units. While commercial uses, they're most often determined by floor area. Not all commercial uses are floor area, but your typical restaurant, office, retail, those are all determined by floor area. But as I mentioned before about these, we have a lot of commercial uses that were built prior to parking minimums, and a lot of those older buildings, they either took up the entire lot of the property, or they provided maybe 1 or 2 parking spaces in the rear just for loading. So in order to determine the non-conforming or grandfathered parking spaces, there's just a lot of research involved to see. You have to go back to when the building was built and the use and the parking requirement at the time and track it over the years to see if the use changed to require more parking or less parking. They could potentially lose parking spaces. So for example, you could have a restaurant and then right next to a office or retail store. And if you look at the history of the office or retail store, it may have previously been a restaurant in the 60s, and now they want to convert it to a restaurant today, but that's a greater parking requirement than the office and retail use. So even though it was previously a restaurant, they want to establish a restaurant today, they would have to get special approval if the parking is not provided on site or through an off-premise lease. And throughout my time in zoning, I've noticed that just these required off-street parking spaces can really be a burden on small businesses, especially, for example, for downtown on North 2nd and North 1st Street, just the way the zoning districts are drawn on the map. You could have a restaurant, a 1,000 square foot restaurant in the B2 zoning district that requires 1 per 100. So that would require 10 parking spaces, but not even a block down the road, you're in the B4 zoning district that doesn't require any. You could have a 3,000 square foot restaurant with no parking requirement, and not even a block down the road, you could have a 1,000 square foot restaurant that requires 10 parking spaces. So just that doesn't really make it very friendly for businesses who want to establish in Richmond when you have these very complex and kind of arbitrary parking requirements based where you are. So in May of 2021, City Council adopted a resolution to change the zoning ordinance to eliminate parking space minimums regardless of use, regardless of location in the city. And now this resolution, it does not involve anything with monitoring on-street parking, creating parking permit zones, or we're not going out and actively eliminating parking spaces. This is simply just saying that if a new business or a new building is constructed, that the zoning ordinance will not enforce how many parking spaces are required. We're going to let either the developer or the small business owner determine how many parking spaces they want to provide. If their business is reliant on parking, then they can either provide it or find a space that has it, or if they don't want parking, then they won't have to provide it. So this is the resolution that we're focusing on. Of the 3 zoning changes, this one is kind of the most straightforward in regards to what we're going to be proposing, and it's to eliminate the parking space minimums. And in the zoning ordinance, we have sections that talk about requiring trees and lighting. That would not impact this requirement. This is just the number of parking spaces. So we would still have buffer requirements to make parking areas look nice, but just the number is what we're looking at here. And so we looked across the country to see what other cities are eliminating parking space minimums. And one of the first major cities to do this was Buffalo, New York, back in 2017. They eliminated all parking spaces. And you also have, just a few months ago, Raleigh, North Carolina eliminated parking space minimums, along with Hartford, Connecticut. So those cities are similar in size to Richmond, but then you also have the larger cities like Minneapolis, Portland, and San Francisco. And what a lot of these cities did is they didn't go from requiring a lot of parking to eliminating it. It was a very incremental approach, similar to kind of what Richmond has done. We required parking, and then we created those overlay districts. We created districts that didn't require parking except for those uses. So this seems like the next step, having that incremental approach to eliminating parking space minimums. Some of the parking reform considerations we're looking at is shared parking. I know Councilman Addison, when he came up with this resolution, was really big on creating these shared parking spaces. We're looking at the Diamond District and City Center, where you have these office uses or that are not being used during the weekends that could potentially be used by others that are using or that are visiting the area. And so really, just rather than having each property have their own parking, creating these shared parking spaces is what we're going to be looking at. And also, some cities are creating parking maximums. So if a developer wanted to come in and build a multifamily building and have 3 parking spaces per dwelling unit, is that something that we would really support to have that much parking per dwelling unit. So that's something that we'll be looking at as well. And the main reason for this reform is to support multimodal mobility. We have the relatively new pulse line going from west to east, and we're looking at having a north to south line as well, but also creating more bike lanes and making it safer for pedestrians to move across the city. And we have some new concepts as well with the scooters and things like that. So we're aware that these other types of multimodal mobility are not going to completely overtake the car. We know that cars are still important, but we're just trying to decrease the reliance on the automobile. And we think that these proposed changes will really support that. And as I mentioned before about being a burden on businesses, we think that these parking reforms will be a cost saving for business rather than making a business provide off-premise parking that is probably not going to be used. Or even there's research that shows that when you require parking for a large development, that cost gets trickled down to the people renting or purchasing housing. So that is what we're looking at for parking. And now for the last zoning change is to permit accessory dwelling units. And a lot of us are probably familiar with what accessory dwelling units are, but for those who are not familiar, they are a smaller independent dwelling unit located on the same lot as another residential structure. So per the zoning ordinance, a dwelling unit consists of a place for eating, sleeping, and sanitation. So it doesn't have to be a full-blown kitchen, but you can just have a little kitchenette, but it does require a full bath for the full sanitation. And then you could either have a separate bedroom or more of a studio space for it to be considered a dwelling unit. And these ADUs are also known as accessory apartments, secondary suites, in-law suites, or granny flats. And as I'll get into on the next slide, you'll see that they can be internal, attached, or detached. So a lot of us, when we think of ADUs, we think of on the top left here, you have your main dwelling, and then you have your detached, smaller accessory dwelling unit. But as you can see here, there are a lot of other different types of ADUs, whether it's an addition to the home, it's the second floor, it's a basement, it's above a garage, or even a garage conversion. So a lot of times seeing a dwelling or seeing a home from the outside, you may not even recognize an ADU in any of these scenarios, but on the top left, it might be the most obvious. But if you have an ADU in the basement, you're really not going to see it from the outside. So a lot of us are thinking this top left, but I just wanted to show you of all the different types of ADUs that could be possibly done and what we're looking at pursuing in this zoning change here. So some of the benefits of accessory dwelling units, some of us are probably familiar with these, but is a place for an aging parent to stay on the property. It's also a way for empty nesters to downsize while they can stay in the neighborhood that they've been in over the years, and allowing a place for a full-time caregiver to be close by at a minute's notice, but also having their separate space when needed. And these ADUs are typically smaller, so they're more affordable to rent than a full-size home or an apartment. And it can provide an additional source of income to the property owner. And here is just an example of how an ADU can benefit a family. To the left here, you have a couple with a young kid. They may only need the main dwelling, and then they can rent out that accessory dwelling unit for supplemental income. But then as time goes on, they have another kid, they need more space. Maybe they need that accessory dwelling unit for a place for the kids to play, and so they're not going to be renting it out at this time of their life. But then as time goes on, the empty nesters, the kids move out, and they may not need the large main dwelling but they want to stay in the neighborhood, they want to age in place, so they'll live in the ADU, but then rent out the main dwelling to provide for housing for others. So this is just an example to show how an ADU can really benefit a family like this. And these accessory dwelling units have been around for quite some time in the planning world. So we have a lot of national research that has been done to show the benefits of these ADUs. And some of the benefits that I mentioned in the previous slides, but it also decreases urban sprawl. Typically uses less energy for heating and cooling of these smaller units. And it expands the housing choices in single family areas. And as we went through the update to the master plan in Richmond 300 from 2017 up until 2020, the housing section, we heard a lot about these accessory dwelling units. So we knew we had to incorporate this into the Richmond 300 master plan under the inclusive housing section about expanding housing opportunities. And here are some examples to show where ADUs are specifically referenced in the master plan, saying that they should be allowed by right in all residential zoning districts. And as a goal, it allows residents to age in place within their neighborhood. So how are accessory dwelling units kind of regulated in the city right now? So that if you wanted to build a detached accessory dwelling unit, unless you have a legal carriage house or a legal ADU in the backyard, if you wanted to build a brand new one today, it requires a special use permit in every single residential zoning district except the R63. And even then, there's more requirements and it requires a separate, relatively long approval process. So it was just very discouraging getting phone calls from people saying that they wanted to build an ADU in their backyard for their aging parents. And I'd have to tell them that a special use permit's required. It's probably 6 to 9 months. It's going to cost this much money. And then they would kind of just give up on it because that was too much time. So what we're really looking to do is to allow these accessory dwelling units by right so people don't have to get a special use permit, which requires planning commission and city council approval. And a lot of times, unless it's really egregious, these ADUs get approved anyway. So we're really looking at what would we allow by right versus what would still require administrative approval, whether through the Board of Zoning Appeals or through a special use permit. And back in 2020, we did an ADU survey, kind of asking similar questions. And one of the results we found from the survey is a question: do you believe that accessory dwelling units should be permitted by zoning in your neighborhood? Not just in the city of Richmond, this is specifically in the neighborhood that you live in. And we had over 80% of respondents say yes, that they should be allowed. So we just found that very encouraging. We knew we weren't going to get 100% consensus on this, but just 80% is an overwhelming majority of people that would be open to having ADUs in the neighborhood that they live in. So from that survey, we asked about some of the benefits and concerns, and similar to the nationwide research that's been done with the benefits, talks about aging parents, your boomerang children, special needs, the affordability, staying in the neighborhood, and that supplemental income. So what we heard from the city of Richmond is very similar to what's going on across the nation. And even with the concerns, we heard the parking, the quality, the aesthetics of the ADU, the density, the potential for a short-term rental, and also the potential tenants living in an accessory dwelling unit. So in April of 2021, the Planning Commission approved a resolution of intent to prepare changes to the zoning ordinance to allow these by right in the residential zoning districts. So this this resolution of intent is kind of a little open in regards to, we know we want to allow them, but as I mentioned before, what would we want to allow by right versus what would still require special approval for these ADUs. So some of the considerations we're going to be looking at is for the ADUs, the location, whether we look at certain different zoning districts, whether they're allowed in parts of the city. It says to allow it in all residential zoning districts, but maybe depending on the location, it may impact the regulations of the ADU. And right now you're allowed to have an accessory structure on the side and rear yard of a property, and it's not allowed in the front yard. So we imagine something similar to that as being in the rear or side yard, so it's not between the main building and the street line, but also floor area. Some of the cities we're looking at, if it's a detached structure, they limit the size of the ADU, whether it's 400 square feet or 500 square feet. But if it's attached, we're also looking at potentially maybe the floor area of the ADU can only be a third of the floor area of the main dwelling, or maybe 40%. But in order for it to be truly accessory, we know that it should probably be smaller than the main dwelling, or else if you build an ADU that's the same size as the dwelling, then that's really two single-family homes on the property. And also for height, right now, a detached structure, so a garage, you're allowed to have 20 feet as the height limit, and depending on the roof line, you can work it a little bit to get that increased midpoint height. But that's another thing we're going to be looking at. And then if it's attached to the home, then potentially it could be the same height as the house. And then going back to the parcel coverage, each residential zoning district has a lot coverage requirement, and those lot coverage requirements are there to protect views, light, and air. And if you have an ADU that's in the basement conversion, that doesn't increase the lot coverage requirement. But just if it's detached or an addition to the dwelling, then to see how the lot coverage requirement will come into play with these ADUs, and then potentially the number of occupants in the ADU. And as I mentioned before, the short-term rental aspect of it. And that's why we wanted to group ADUs and short-term rentals and parking all together. So with the parking reform, we looked at cities across the country because there weren't as many that eliminated parking spaces. Actually, there are no other cities in Virginia that truly eliminated parking spaces. But for the ADUs, they're happening all across the country, but we really wanted to focus just on localities in Virginia. So here are four of ones that we are looking at. Arlington County and City of Alexandria, they have a separate ADU permit that's done administratively, where you just apply for the permit, you meet building code requirements, you meet underlying zoning setbacks, and it gets approved. There's no special approval required. And the city of Virginia Beach, they allow these cottage ADUs in certain zoning districts. And then Norfolk is allowing these as well. And I know city of Charlottesville is working on them as well. So we're really kind of playing catch up with these other cities. So we don't require every ADU to get a special use permit. So that's a recap of the three zoning changes that we discussed today. As Maritza mentioned, these are three separate ordinances that will be approved by City Council. We anticipate maybe some taking longer than others, but these are really going to be separate ordinances that are going to require separate approval from Planning Commission and City Council. And then here's a proposed timeline that we're looking at for these three zoning changes. We had, as Maritza mentioned, the public meeting yesterday in person at the library, and we're here today for the virtual meeting. And then as of yesterday morning, we posted on the three zoning changes website a survey. If you click the drop down three zoning changes, it's that very first line. You'll say click here, and that will take you to the online survey. For the in-person one yesterday, we had hard copies of the survey and we had poster boards, but for this virtual one, we're encouraging everyone to submit the survey online, and this will be open until September 9th. So that gives us about a month to get feedback so we can go about the proposals for these zoning changes. And then next week, we're having these telephone town halls. So next Tuesday at 6 p.m. and then next Wednesday at 12 noon, similar to this week, we're doing a telephone town hall, which is relatively new. It's not your typical in-person or virtual. You register online and you'll receive a phone call at the time of the meeting, and we'll give a brief presentation. It won't be as long as what it was today, but then it's really just a Q&A opportunity to allow the group to hear questions and answers. And then as part of the survey that you'll see online, we're really trying to gauge interest if we want to form these focus groups. Maybe you have expertise in one of these zoning changes and you want to provide more recommendations or proposals. We're looking at forming some of these focus groups to really narrow down these proposals and send them to city council with our best recommendations. And then we'll be working on the draft for these proposals from September through October. And then we're going to have another round of community engagement with our proposed changes to the 3 zoning changes in October. And we envision it's probably going to be a similar format in regards to an in-person meeting at the library and a virtual option as well. And then we'll prepare the ordinances and make several presentations to Planning Commission, and then hopefully City Council approval either late 2022 or early 2023. So that's roughly the timeline we're looking at. But again, I want to stress that these are 3 separate ordinances, and this is not a group approval. It's really 3 separate ordinances, but we wanted to bring them all together to present today. And that's all I had to present today.
So thank you, Brian and Allison, for that presentation. I want to, so during the last night we had breakout groups as well. We had open Q&A and then breakout groups. We're not going to do breakout groups here by topic because we can't do that by topic easily on Teams. So instead we'll be as a big group. So first I want to take some questions, let's say for like 5-10 minutes about short-term rentals. And then after that, we'll do parking minimums. And then after that, we'll do ADUs, just to kind of keep it to topic. So I'm going to call on people based on the order of their hand raised. And then I will also, after we take a couple of people who are on virtually, we'll go to the phone and see if anyone on the phone has questions or comments. Thomas, go ahead.
Yes. Hello. Thank you guys for your presentation, and hello, Daniel Wagner, who I know has dealt with me before. In relation to short-term rentals and accessory dwelling units, there's versions of legal and illegal. And what I refer to there is it's not really clear if the zoning department requires a certificate of occupancy for either single family, multifamily, or accessory dwelling unit for those to be legal items in order to operate short-term rentals. So many of the applicants are likely not to apply because they converted a space in their home to a separate apartment, thereby changing the definition to multifamily when it was not allowed. And same thing with accessory dwelling units. If they built one without a permit, then it was never really given a certificate of occupancy, nor was it reflected in the tax assessment. But my comment here is basically the overlap of the finance department, the zoning department, and the real estate tax assessment. I think it's a different department, but those separate entities have not overlapped well in order to roll out a good overlapping policy, because as you either build an accessory dwelling unit or start operating short-term rentals, your assessment or your permitting or certificate of occupancy could change. So, and that's not clear in the ordinances at the moment.
Okay, thanks for that comment. So, and you're talking about like, you build a space, the building commissioner comes out to inspect it and gives you a CO saying, yeah, this space can be inhabited. And then that might change your density of your, it might change your tax assessment because it might change your density. Because now your property ostensibly might be worth more because of that increase.
So I had previously been operating short-term rentals in multifamily homes, which I had a certificate of occupancy for, but many of the unregistered short-term rental operators probably do not apply because once the zoning department learns that their single-family home has a separate apartment that was never permitted, then they're like, this is not approved because you don't have a multifamily certificate of occupancy.
That makes sense.
Same with accessory dwelling units. If it's never been registered with a building permit, it's may not be an occupiable building.
Right, and that's something that someone brought up something like that last night at the meeting, how they have like a cottage in the back of their property that has been a rental for decades. But you know, who knows if it has an actual like permit. So thanks for bringing that up. Awesome. Stacy?
Hi there. Thanks for having this meeting. I appreciate the presentations, and I missed the meeting last night, but I just really have a comment, and I've had the opportunity over the past 2 years to sit in city council meetings and meet with Mr. Vonk about this. So I'm just gonna make the comment. You talked earlier about the fact that there's 800 short-term rentals and only 100 and something permits, and how do we get the rest of the people to come on board? And the reason they're not going to come on board is because the way the ordinance is written right now, they won't be allowed to come on board. Most short-term rentals in the city of Richmond, the folks don't live in them 185 days a year. That's not the way Airbnb really works anymore. I understand that in the past, Airbnb started as, oh, I'll rent a bedroom in the back of my house, or I'll let somebody stay in my house when I'm on a vacation, but that's not how Airbnb works anymore. People want to come and stay in a separate unit that's all theirs without the owner's clothes hanging in the closet. So that's how most Airbnbs are functioning in Richmond right now, under the radar mostly, because the ordinance that was passed, you'll never get 800 people because they wouldn't be approved. So again, we're hoping that you guys can take another look at the 185-day rule and allow people who might have another home somewhere in the city of Richmond nearby them, maybe another way to look at restricting it so you don't have people buying up 30 houses and Airbnb them. We don't want that. But maybe each social security number or each resident of Richmond gets 2 Airbnbs or 1 Airbnb, but the 185-day rule is what is holding up you getting people to comply. And they're going to keep flying under the radar for as long as they can, is my guess. So in regards to your focus group, that's a great idea. And we've also talked to Mr. Vonk about some kind of a community volunteer panel to try and bring other owners of short-term rentals into compliance, to explain to them how to do it, to get them to comply, and also to make sure that there are not bad actors. You know, you're going to have your crummy Airbnb. Well, I mean, you know, Airbnb is a very much a sort of you're rated every time a guest has an experience. So most Airbnbs are really well taken care of and beautifully maintained. But we don't want bad actors, and we could also, as a community of Airbnb hosts, sort of help the city manage what's going on in the Airbnb community. So we're all for that. But anyway, those are my comments. And I appreciate the meeting and look forward to that focus group that you mentioned.
Maritza, I think you're muted.
Thank
There we
you.
go.
Thank you, Stacy. Anybody on the phone, you just press *6 to unmute. So I'm going to pause and see if anyone on the phone has a comment. So I will go to Julie.
Hi, I wanted to clarify the permit process for short-term rentals as it currently stands. If you're using your dwelling as a short-term rental, but you're limiting it to more than 30 nights, are you still required to have a permit?
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that would not be considered a short-term rental. That would be considered long-term. But if you rent it out under 30 days and you don't have that permit, then that's where it would not be allowed.
Understood. And I also just wanted to second Stacy's comments about the 185-day dwelling. So I am a resident of Texas with an Airbnb in Richmond City, and I have for the last 2+ years restricted it to 30-day plus days, which is obviously not ideal for me, and I think also for the economy in general, because I think you'd have a lot more visitors if you're able to have short-term people coming in for weekends and whatnot. So that's kind of how I've gotten around it, is just limiting it for 30 plus days, but that also causes lots of vacancies. So I might have, 6 weeks of a gap because one person rented it for a few months, and then I have that 30-day restriction and there's nowhere to fill it. So I think the 185-day restriction is really something that's holding a lot of people back.
Thank you. All right, Julie.
Hi. Thank you again. I appreciate the presentation. It was very well done. And I'll limit this right now just to talking about the owner occupied, but why in reality do you really want to change owner occupation as one of the requirements for short-term rentals? As I understand it, this was carefully negotiated out with people in neighborhoods and citizens during the last round of this. And this is something that really was important to people who did live in the neighborhoods where this may have the greatest impact. What I think I've heard you say is that one of the primary reasons you're looking at doing this is because of the administration that is involved in it, and sort of the capacity of the city to really effectively enforce it. Is that accurate?
So we're not making a recommendation at this point to make any changes. It's more, we were required by the ordinance that was passed, establishing the current regulations that we have, said that we needed to revisit the regulations a year after adoption. And so that's what we're doing right now. It's a conversation about the regulations we have now, and we're just presenting the information that we have at the moment. We have those rules on the books, and then Brian shared how many people have actual permits right now, but we're not actually making any recommendations at this moment in time.
Do you mind if I share some feedback? One of the goals was not to have a hotel business, which was like a person renting out 10 units in a 10-unit building. But the designation of your building as either single family or multifamily, you can live in half of your multifamily building and still rent out the other half because you're occupying more than 180 days a year. But as a single family owner and you vacate, that changes the 185-day a little bit. But if you live in a duplex and you rent out the other half, you can rent it out as much as you want.
So, Julie, I totally understand how the owner occupancy requirement came to be. And I understand the concerns that community members have about, potentially living on a block with several short-term rentals, and then not having kind of regular neighbors next to you that are always there. So that's something that we're very aware of as a concern that community members have.
So if I might just elaborate on that 1 second. As I listen to this conversation, one of the things that strikes me is we really are not talking about the impact that these have on the people who live in these neighborhoods day to day, year to year. And in fact, there are a lot of complicating factors that can be a part of making the transition and the change that you're talking about. And therefore, I think that whatever we do with this, it's really important that the city develop the platforms in order to administer any of these things really well. I think we would all agree that the city has limited resources. This has not perhaps been the area where you've had the greatest success in the past, but I would hope that in the implementation of these, that you really are thinking about how you're going to build the platforms in order to make these function better than they are. And I would also like to comment that I think the notion of doing focus groups is a really, really good one. And I would suggest that one of those groups specifically bring together the people who are the presidents of the neighborhood associations, to really talk from their perspectives about what they understand and the valuable insights I think they can give you in terms of how to move forward with this. I will tell you, I live in the Fan, and there is huge concern about not having owner occupation in those units, because we understand, being VCU, a lot of unintended things happen, and we have very little control over them.
Thank you. I want to get
Thank
as
you.
many people as possible, so I want to.
You're muted again, Mirza.
I just unmuted myself by accident. I want to get as many questions as possible, so I want to avoid the back and forth as much as we can so that we can hear from a lot of people. Okay, we're going to take Thomas, Chloe, and Daniel, and then we're going to move on to parking. So go ahead, Thomas, unmute.
Hi, I work in building codes, and I wanted to ask a question. One of the things that I know happens if you remove the owner occupation requirement is it could potentially kick these Airbnbs in the building code into an R3, which might require fire sprinklers. So in addition to the concerns about there being, a housing affordability crisis and the integrity of a neighborhood, removing that occupancy requirement can trigger some other consequences that I think would make it much harder for these businesses to run if you were to actually enforce the full letter and intent of the building code along with your zoning ordinance. The other thing that I was concerned about or had a question, well, two other things I had a question about. One was if you pass an ordinance to collect taxes on these things, my fiance uses these a lot for work. And my understanding is that VRBO and Airbnb automatically collect taxes when notified by a locality that an ordinance has been passed. So that seems to make your enforcement really easy, because then you know everyone who's registered and you can cross-reference it with those remittances. I guess it gets tricky with the living requirement from there, unless you know how many days a year they're doing it. But that was just the thought I had. And then the last thing I wanted to say is there's a clear interaction between ADUs and short-term rentals. So if someone buys a house, I live in Churchill, and there's a lot of these houses around here that have already a granny flat that's fully renovated, whether or not it's being used as one, and a carriage house. So if someone lives upstairs, especially on the south of Marshall and like the oldest part of Churchill, it's very common to see houses like that. So if someone lives on the main floor of a house, can they Airbnb their basement and their carriage house and still satisfy that 50% plus one requirement? Because that seems to, or the 185 days, I'm sorry, 185 days living requirement, because I don't think that should count. You're taking two living units off the market if you're living in one of them to satisfy a short-term rental. I could just see how that creates some perverse incentives for the local housing market in the neighborhood that I live in, where all these older houses in this really chic, nice part of the neighborhood get bought up essentially by rental companies, where 2/3 of the units or half of the units are being converted to short-term rentals. It's a similar concern to what Julie had addressed about neighborhood integrity. That was all I had.
Thank you, Thomas, for that. We'll check with our building commissioner on the building code. I would imagine that the building code has to be applied to, as appropriately to single family and multifamily. But we'll check with him. And then on tax collection, the General Assembly just passed a law that admittedly I haven't dug into the details of, but that enables, but we're going to dig into it during this process, enables localities to collect taxes from the short-term rental operators. And so that is something that we'll look into as a potential future thing. And in that scenario, the operators would, collect the tax and remit it to the city. And it would be added on to beyond the actual fee of renting the space. Okay, Chloe.
I just wanted to say first, thank you so much for providing so many opportunities to weigh in on these 3 changes. I think that they're really important all three of them to the development of the city. I work in the affordable housing field, but I am speaking as a private citizen of Richmond in the fan. And I just wanted to say that I support wholeheartedly and will do so in the upcoming budget process, aligning our fiscal resources with what is necessary to enforce these regulations. Coming from Churchill and moving into the fan, as a resident, I'm really aware of the impact that short-term rentals have had on the neighborhoods. And working in the field of affordable housing, I'm very concerned about the fact that we have 800 of these short-term rentals that are available just sort of on a snapshot of Airbnb, which is a single platform, and there are multiple, when we know that there is a housing shortage. And anything that we can do to have rentals returned to the long-term rental market, I think is an important step for us to take. To hear on this call people calling from out of state and saying that what they're doing is going without any resident for 6 or 7 weeks sometimes because they're skirting the existing regulation by renting only for greater than 30 days. That's called a lease and being a landlord. And I think that that is really important to note, that what we are seeing is non-compliance with the current regulation, sort of a willful go around of it. And essentially that unit then, instead of being occupied for half of the time by an owner occupant, is now sitting empty by this administrator's own admission for up to half of the year. And as a person who works to place people into apartments and works to finance apartments, that's incredibly concerning to me, as we know that one of the changes that has happened in these dense neighborhoods is the deconversion of multifamily units into single family units.
Thank you, Chloe, for your remarks. I wrote them down, and I appreciate your comments as well as everyone else's. Daniel, and then we'll move on to parking.
Hey everyone, I will try to be brief because at this point I think the folks who have commented have covered a lot of the most important bases. But I want to obviously first shout out Thomas Courtney. It's good to see you again, and thanks for continuing to be being involved in this process. I really think that one of the critical pieces here, as Thomas brought up, is ensuring that we have a seamless way and a very clear way for operators to register and permit their STRs, first and foremost, so that we have an easy way for tracking, for enforcement, and additionally to ensure that folks can comfortably come into compliance. I think what I keep hearing throughout all of these engagement sessions that you all have put on over the past couple of years is a narrative around a desire to come into compliance. And I think we have to be very clear that the primary residency requirement is in fact a best practice, especially in the context of a housing crisis, Richmond being at the forefront within Virginia in a lot of cases. So I think the creating fewer barriers for ensuring that folks can identify their units, can register appropriately, be billed appropriately with their taxes through coordination with the finance department, through planning, et cetera, is going to be preeminent. And then moving us towards a place of recognizing that we need to maybe this isn't on the city, but we'll have to find a way to kind of help folks get towards a place where they're becoming a landlord as opposed to operating STRs, because we need to bring those units back on the market, as Chloe mentioned, and as Thomas alluded to as well in his comments, the second Thomas. So again, thank you all very much, and I appreciate this conversation.
Thank you, Daniel, for those remarks. I wrote them down. I've been taking notes if you guys haven't noticed when everyone speaks. So thank you for that. Any questions or comments on the parking minimum? And then I'll go to the phone after Steve and Jody go. So Steve, unmute.
Hi. So Steve and I are here together, but this is Sheila.
Excellent.
So I'm concerned about an unintended consequences of eliminating the parking spaces. I live in the museum district. And, right now we have a building being built behind us that is going to be like for 4 families. That was only for 2 families. And there's parking spaces being also eliminated in places where we had like parking lots behind our houses in these double wide alleys. And I think saying you don't have to require parking is going to end up having more buildings built. As you said, we're trying to be friendly to developers and businesses, but we're being friendly to the environment and being friendly to the residents. I know we're trying to get people to drive less cars, but I don't want that parking lot to go away and a big building built there. I want that parking lot to go away and green space put there. That's my comment.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila. One thing on that we have kind of the data has shown from other cities and things is that when you eliminate parking minimums, developers still build parking, and businesses still have parking. A really good example of this is and they do that because of market demand. So a good example of this is the Dominion Tower that was recently built. It's in the B4 district, which doesn't require any parking for office space. However, they still built a big parking garage because they know that in order for them to attract employees, they need to be able to provide on-site parking. And so often what actually happens with developments in Richmond is we have the minimum requirements currently. So not in the B4, but in other districts. And oftentimes developers build more than what is required because they know that, because they feel like they need more parking in order to meet the demand of their tenants. Also, banks often require parking. They'll review the developer's proposals and they'll require parking. So we're basically saying with the elimination of parking minimums, we would be saying, hey, we as the government are not going to set the threshold. We're going to let the market set the threshold because we know the market is going to provide parking, and they will. And so that's what this change in regulation would do. Jody, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. At the city, you're well aware of the impact that minimum parking requirements have on small businesses. I just wanted to share my support for eliminating parking minimums from the perspective of an architect who works with these small businesses. Nearly every single one of my small business restaurant clients and similar scale clients in Churchill and South Side and North Side have had to apply for some sort of exemption through BZA or an SUP process. And without fail, every single time it's approved because people want these businesses in their neighborhoods and they want walkable neighborhoods. So in effect, all it does is add extra time and expense to a small business owner who's maybe paying rent for additional months while they're waiting for the SUP process to play out. And they're paying me to handle the process. So I just kind of wanted to go on the record from an anecdotal perspective and share that.
Thank you, Jody. And Brian supports the BZA as well, the Board of Zoning Appeals for people who don't know the acronym. And he has seen that through his own experience, right, Brian?
Correct. Yeah, I can't recall the BZA ever turning down. And I've only been here 5 years. I'm sure there have been cases before that, but I can't recall them turning down the waiver of the parking space because, as Jody mentioned, it's like we do want the business there. It's just a matter of getting that special approval. And I've seen firsthand experience. It delays the opening of the business by several months, and it goes right to the business owner.
Yeah, and oftentimes the business owner is filling a vacant commercial space that, like in a walkable urban type of neighborhood that was previously commercial. So it's sort of like restoring the historic use that was there to support that kind of dense walkable place. Julie. Wait, one sec, Julie, don't go yet. I said I was going to go to the phone next. Does anyone on the phone want to ask a question, *6 to unmute. Okay, Julie, go ahead.
Just a comment, and that is to say, if you're thinking about many of the neighborhoods which are in the core and or more dense, and by their nature, people love density because we're here. But I think it's important to remember that all neighborhoods are not made alike. And in fact, if you have a family, if you are living in the Fan or West Grace or Oregon Hill or wherever down here, in fact, we don't yet have the amenities such that we cannot use cars. Getting them, have them all yet. And I think it's important to remember that that's very different than sedition, for instance, where you have a young clientele, a young group of people who find in the neighborhood things that they need and they don't need cars. So parking, I think, you remember for those of us that live down here, especially around VCU, is we have no control over the number of people are trying to park here. There are many, many instances where people are building, and in fact, they are not including parking. All of that has to be absorbed by the people in those neighborhoods. So for me to say, we're going to leave it to the private sector as to whether you will do parking or not, whether the market will take it or not, I think I really don't understand. I think we lose nothing by saying there has to be at least a minimum. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I wrote them down, and definitely heard it kind of echoed what Sheila and Sheila said. All right, Carol and David, and then we'll go on to accessory dwelling units. Carol. Or Carly, C-A-R-Y-L.
Hi, sorry about that. I live in the museum district. I'm also hopeful that we can maintain some parking requirements. This discussion has conflated business with development of residential, and they're two different things. I agree with everything people have said, that the neighbors have to absorb the inevitable cars that will be here. And why shouldn't the cost of parking trickle down to the new renters of new developments? They should. You're changing the character of our neighborhoods, and it's making it more unpleasant to live here. We wanted to live here for the beauty of our city and the walkability, but it is walkable, but we still need cars. They are a necessity and they're an undeniable reality. That's all.
Thank you, Carol. This resolution doesn't say, like, we know that there's cars, we know that people will be driving and parking, and we will continue to probably have cars for decades to come as the main mode of transportation for many people. And as I mentioned before, a lot of times developments, when new residential buildings are built, they still will have parking even if there are no parking requirements. It would just eliminate that administrative process. And then also sometimes legislative process where people go through in order only to reduce parking requirements in some instances. Usually those are the smaller businesses that are looking to try and do that. But we'll collect some data about that information, about kind of the instances of people getting exemptions for parking and who they are. And then also kind of understanding in districts where we've eliminated parking requirements, like the B4 and the TOD1 districts, kind of investigating how many parking spots get built in those buildings. Because we know, as with the Dominion example, that people still build parking even if we don't require it. David.
Hi, thank you. I don't have a lot to say, just generally want to voice my support for eliminating parking minimums. I'm a resident in Manchester and previously Shockoe Bottom, and I think one of the things that stood out to me was how much it hurts small businesses. I think to your point, developers that are building large buildings are still going to build the parking they need, but by having these minimums, we're really hurting the small businesses the most. And the shared parking aspect of it, potentially down the road, really stood out to me as a good solution. When I see a lot of empty surface parking lots, that's pretty frustrating thinking about what else could be there. So thank you for doing this. That's all.
Thank you, David. Daniel, Jason, and Chloe, were all your questions about comments all about parking or moving to ADUs? Daniel, unmute.
Hey, I'm back. Yes, this is related to the parking requirements. I would just want to back up everything that David and Jody brought up. I think one of the critical pieces, and I understand a sense of discomfort with the notion of reducing or working towards reducing our reliance on car infrastructure, especially in this current moment that we live in all across the city, including our densest neighborhoods. The car infrastructure is the most prominent, and it is understandable that folks are not feeling comfortable or that there's a space for them to adequately use those spaces on foot, on bike, using a wheelchair, walking, riding, rolling, etc., getting on a bus. And I think that there's a real opportunity with the thoughtful investment that these folks are asking for, that we can get to that place. I think Richmond 300 has given us a really wonderful vision for what that can look like. Now the onus is on us as a city and as residents who helped form that plan to move forward and actually implement it and build from that. I think the eliminating of the parking space minimums is a great step to, one, procedurally take some work off of the planning department's hands, because a lot of these different zoning considerations, the parking sections are deeply complex, and it is a lot of extra work for Brian and Maritza that is unnecessary. But importantly, we also get to a place where we can more effectively implement the vision of Richmond 300. David mentioned looking at an underutilized parking lot where it's only ever maybe a third full, and thinking, what could be there? Could it be housing? Could it be a new business? Could it be both? And really getting to a place where instead of sitting there with a developer just collecting rent for parking spaces, we could be moving to a place where the city can collect substantive tax revenue, which will be really, really important for us to get to a place where we can actually have the money and the resources and staff capacity to implement some of the amenities for walkability, for pedestrian access, cyclist access, and folks who want to use a reliable public transit route. So I think all of these really go nicely hand in hand, and I totally appreciate the concerns that folks have, because I think those experiences are deeply valid and should be shared widely, because we need to get to a place where that is possible. So I definitely appreciate it all, and I do think that whether it feels like it or not, this is one step we can take to get us closer there.
Thank you, Daniel. Jason, I want to get to ADUs, but I'm going to have Jason and Chloe go, I think, on parking. Go ahead, Jason.
Thank you. Yes, I don't want to repeat anything that others have already said, but I do want to speak also in favor of removing the minimums. One of the previous speakers commented on the affordability issue, and I don't know if people are entirely aware of how much parking does add to the cost of building. My rough understanding of that is that at least a couple $1,000s per surface parking space and as much as $10,000 per structured parking. And that's a lot of money that is being added to the cost of construction, along with some of the environmental issues that go along with those parking lots. So, given the already difficult situation of affordability of housing in Richmond, I think anything we can do to help at least potentially reduce the cost of those for people who are struggling to pay rent and are only going to continue to struggle, that's worth looking at very closely. Thank you.
Thank you. Chloe?
Yeah, I'll be quick as well. I just wanted to say first, I support removing the minimums that are required currently. And I do want to echo some of the feelings that I hear coming from my neighbors on historic West Grace Street, across Arthur Ashe in the Museum District. It can be disconcerting to see that residential spaces who previously relied on sort of those missing housing units, that can be disconcerting to see those making way instead for new multifamily buildings. And I do totally appreciate that. But prior to living in the Fan, I lived in Church Hill and was on the land use committee of the Church Hill Association. And what we saw time and time again there is that although there are currently parking minimums in place, Planning Commission, City Council, they are not opposed to waiving those parking requirements through the special use permit process. And so truly by having those required minimums, but then not enforcing them through the SUP process, or allowing significant waivers through the SUP process, the end result is that regardless of those minimums in dense residential areas where land is at a premium already, because the neighborhoods are so lovely, we don't really get to reap the benefit of having those parking minimums. And so what I have seen is that, like Jody said, we see an inordinate burden on small businesses that have to go through that same SUP process, but for the business side, the BZA, to get those waivers because the parking is simply not present. And for larger scale developments, like Maritza said, banks do require some parking. That's often part of their underwriting is, do you have the market to show that cars will or won't be needed to fit those units that you're building? But what we don't have the ability to do as a governmental agency is ensure that those parking spaces are provided for residents free of charge. So even in areas that there are requirements for multifamily buildings, large buildings to provide parking, oftentimes the costs, like Jason noted, are significant for parking, and then those are passed along to residents. And as a former resident of a large building like that, I did not pay the additional $75 to $125 per month for one of the structured parking spaces beneath the building. What I did instead was park on the street. And so I'm in support of removing the minimums because I think that it does, while we have a vision of what minimums would require of buildings, that doesn't necessarily come to fruition in our built environment. And so I think letting the market more fully dictate where parking is or isn't removes some of the administrative burden that our city truly doesn't have the capacity to administer, and really nets out better development in the end.
Thank you, Chloe, for your remarks. Wrote them, I took notes. Thanks a lot. Leslie, I want to move on to accessory dwelling units because we have about 12 minutes left on our time, so you can go ahead and unmute.
Hi, thanks. First, I want to really reiterate what others have said. This is a great forum, and I appreciate you guys providing the platform for us to give input. So I moved here last fall from Charlottesville, and part of the incentive for buying my house in Northside was that it was advertised as having a basement apartment that was income producing. And it was not until I had signed a contract and was in the, waiting period between signing the contract and closing that I found out that it wasn't actually a legal unit. And so I'm very excited about the idea of Richmond making this a by right option. And I obviously want to, be first in line to sign up to make my unit legal when it's a possibility. And I'm imagining that that's going to require a visit from an inspector to make sure that it meets code. I know there are especially fire concerns between floors and things like that. It's a basement apartment again. And coming from Charlottesville, where I had an ADU, a legal ADU, I'm really, and I was actually the vice chair of the Housing Advisory Committee there. I'm really interested in Richmond considering some sort of incentive for, obviously this is down the road, ADU owners who rent to someone who is at or below maybe 80 or 60% of AMI. So some sort of, because obviously we have an inspector come and say, it's a legal unit, you now have an ADU, that's going to show up on my tax assessment. I mean, that's just death and taxes are the surest things in life, right? But it would be wonderful if there were also an option for me to say, but I'm renting to someone who is income qualified at 60% or below of AMI. Is there an incentive for that? Because I think that would be a great way to address a fraction of the affordable housing crisis in the city. So that's my 2 cents on ADUs, which I'm fully in support of, obviously. And just thanks again for allowing this forum to happen.
Great, thank you, Leslie. And thanks for the, thinking about that affordability piece. That is something that we have been looking at, trying to figure out how to do that, and how we would administer it. But that is a thought that has come up. So that's thank you for your comments.
Yep. I'm not sure of any place that's doing anything like that, but when I was at Charlottesville, I always looked to the West Coast. They always seem to be ahead of us in things like this.
Seattle has one. They allow you one, and then your second one has to be affordable if you have a second accessory dwelling unit. And I guess my question then is like, how do we administer it? How do we make sure that like
how do you
people
police
are,
it? Yeah.
how are people are actually providing it to qualifying residents? And so that's the piece where I, as we think about writing new legislation, it's easy to write it, but then actually enforcing it and administering it is a different piece.
Absolutely.
So we're trying to think about both of those things as we look at all of these ordinances.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nia?
Hi there. I was just curious, like today, without any of these proposed ordinances, is it legal to reside above a garage that's zoned as like an R garage outbuilding? And if not, would this proposed ADU ordinance make this a legal thing to do and potentially grandfather this in?
Brian, do you want to take that?
Yes. So if it's a legal dwelling unit in there, then it would be allowed. A lot of times we'll see is somebody wants to build a garage and they want to build like an office loft space, but it was illegally converted without the proper permit. So if it's legal, then yes, you can live there. But then it comes down to if it's is it a single family? Like, are you
There's a lot of
yeah.
ifs, right? So
Like how long you live in there, and like, are you related to the people on the property? Because then if you're not related, then it's not a single family, or it could be a potential lodging unit.
So, and I was actually here for like the short-term rental, but a situation is where I know of folks who do legal Airbnb rentals. But in order to make that work, they reside off property, and off property for them is a separate lot that's a garage unit where they reside over it while they're renting out their main property. And I know, I'm not sure if this is common, but I'm, aware that this is a thing that's at least done in a couple scenarios. And if it's legal to do the Airbnb, I'm wondering if it's legal to reside above the garage in order to make the situation work.
Yes, if it's a, approved dwelling unit. And so there are many cases in the city where there are grandfathered carriage house units, because they've been in existence since before we had a zoning ordinance. And then there's people who've gotten special use permits for theirs. I'm sure that there's garage units that people have built that are not legally allowed by zoning, and they've kind of put it in.
Yeah.
So
As we
Okay,
just saw with
awesome.
the last caller, yeah, she bought the
Yeah.
house with the illegal basement, so.
Got it.
Yeah,
And then
but she's not she's not renting it out. So I mean, like,
Correct.
so I mean, like, yeah. But yes, you could, if you have a carriage house or you have a basement unit, let's say, you could rent out and you own the property, it's your primary residence. You could live in one of those and rent out the larger space, according to our current STR regulations.
got it. Thank you.
Susan.
Hi, this is Susan Rebelo, and I'm president of the Beginner Park Residents Association. But actually, I'm just going to speak as myself today, just as a citizen. And first of all, thank you so much for the presentation, the forum. This has been excellent. And I just want to make a few comments about accessory dwelling units. One is that I am totally in support of them for all of the good reasons that you mentioned in your presentation. And I came from a previous wonderful historic district before I relocated here that had lots of accessory dwelling units, and and it worked fine for people that wanted to make staying in their historic homes more affordable as they aged, who wanted to move into those smaller units and let family members take on the larger home. For all of the very good reasons that you mentioned in your presentation, I support accessory dwelling units. I have two concerns that I hope are your considerations about them. One has to do with zoning and codes having requirements so that those accessory dwelling units fit in with the context of the neighborhood, fit in with the character of the neighborhood in terms of the materials use, the style of the accessory dwelling unit. We have a situation in Laburnum Park currently with a home on Gloucester where a homeowner basically installed what looks like a shipping container up against the side of his historic home. And so I think if there isn't some care about the materials utilized, the style of the accessory dwelling unit, you can end up, altering the character of the look of a neighborhood, with some negative consequences. And the second caveat has to do with how those accessory dwelling units are utilized. And again, then we get into the short-term rental thing again. And the neighborhood I came from actually struggled for a while until the city changed their ordinance about short-term rentals, Airbnbs, because what was happening was, rental units, rather than being nice, affordable, small space places for people to rent long-term, became, hundreds and hundreds in my neighborhood of, Airbnbs. And I think that the person who talked about, being rid of the 185-day live-in rule for the owners going away, I think you have to keep in mind, we are not wintergreen. The neighborhoods in Richmond are not resort neighborhoods. People didn't buy into them to live in a resort neighborhood or a hotel district. So I think if there isn't some care taken about regulation of the perhaps the percentage of accessory dwelling units or that can be short-term rentals, a la Airbnb or VBRO, I think you can end up with really, again, altering the quality of life and the character of some of our neighborhoods, our residential neighborhoods in Richmond. So those are my two caveats. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the things that we're kind of looking at is how to make sure that the aesthetics are, how we can include something about that, because we don't want to have like people building like cinder block eyesores in the back of their property that are just not great or attached to the side of their house, right? So those are points well taken. And then
Thank
also,
you.
we're definitely aware of the nexus between ADUs and STRs. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you.
We have about 1 minute left, and because we're going to go to 1:30. So I'm going to do Sarah and then Thomas. So if you could be brief, and then we'll wrap it up.
Hi. My question has to do with the floor area
with ADUs, which I'm very much in support of. Could an ADU ordinance be used to create a duplex in an existing building? That would be closer to like 50-50, but you wouldn't be changing appearances, you wouldn't be constructing anything. And I wonder if other localities have something like this, or if it's just simply.
Yeah, so your question's about the size of the ADU. So a lot of localities have like a maximum, like it can't be larger than 750, 1,000 square feet or something. Or we've also thought about like maybe it can't be that, or like a certain percentage of the primary building size. So that's something for us to kind of consider and think about as we kind of move forward with the analysis. Thomas, go ahead, and then Nelson, you'll have to email us. Brian, could you share your final slide up with everyone, please?
Hey, very quick. In my professional capacity, I worked on these changes to the building code to permit accessory dwelling units in Virginia, although I'm here as a private citizen. I fully support incorporating ADUs into the zoning code. And I just want to reiterate kind of what I said earlier, that I think the intent of ADUs is to promote housing capacity. It was certainly part of the discussion when we were talking about the changes that we made to the state building code in our stakeholder meetings. The intent was not to permit additional income creating models for homeowners. It was to increase housing capacity and address the housing crisis. That was explicitly the reason that they were trial run in Northern Virginia. In that capacity, I just want to say, I think, I personally believe that they should not be able to be used as a short-term rental. You wouldn't allow someone whose primary residence is an entire structure, an entire dwelling unit, to have a 185-day residency requirement. And then if they cut it up into separate units, then all of a sudden that we ignore that for the separate units that they've created with the ADU procedures. I think those 185-day requirements should be based per dwelling unit. That's it.
Thank you, Thomas, for your comments. If you wouldn't mind sharing your expertise on the ADU part for the building code, anything we have a building commissioner, but if you worked on it very specifically, it might be helpful to get in touch with you. So if you could reach out to Brian Mercer, his email's on the screen, brian.mercer@rva.gov. I'm going to wrap it up now, Nelson. I hope you can email your comment or question to Brian, please. And if you go to our website, which is shown here on the screen, rva.gov/planning-development-review/zoning changes, you can find our survey. Next week, we're going to do a telephone town hall, which is something I have never done before. So I hope you will encourage people to join us there as we experiment with this new model of engaging with community members. There will be no visual presentation. It's completely conducted on the telephone. Thank you so much for all your comments. At max, we had about 71 people join us today. Have a wonderful Wednesday.
Maritza, can I just make one comment? The slides from the meeting today are also on the website here. So if you want to review what we presented today, the slides are available on the website.
Thank you for adding that. I meant to say it. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.